Hello, I'm J Washburn,
And I'm Joe Bendowski.
and this is Start Writing. And today we're going to do the next episode in Jay's Beginner's Guide to Writing a Novel. My wife listened to our episode from last week, and she
Oh,
was,
last month.
yeah, sorry, I'm thinking it's been like 5 weeks. And she pointed out how we shortchanged ourselves. Joe, you and I were talking, and we were saying, I think it's been 2, maybe 3 years. So I went and looked it up. We started 12 April 2016. So it's over 5 years that we've been doing this.
Wow.
We have over 100,000 downloads. And by the time we finish this series that we're working on today, we'll have over 150 episodes. Anyway, it's a pretty big accomplishment, and to you listeners, I mean, you probably know this from listening, but the lion's share of this effort goes to Joe, and it's been a really cool accomplishment that we've had, and I'm excited to chip in a little more with this series.
Yeah. I can't believe we produced that much content. That's a lot of
Yeah,
content when I think
yeah,
about
it's
it.
so funny. It went by so fast. We're like guessing 2 or 3 years. Anyway, okay. The next thing I want to mention, I am I've done graphic design in some of my work history, and so these episodes that you're listening to now, if you're listening to just the audio, I also created visuals for, and you just need to go down into the show notes, and there will be a link to YouTube if you prefer to watch it. Having said that, we're going to try to make it so all the content is listenable. And that's actually the way I prefer to listen to a podcast and not watch, because I like to do it while I'm driving or whatever. So it's viewable both ways. If you want the YouTube option, look in the show notes.
Awesome.
Okay, so by way of review, last time in our first episode in the series, we talked about the braid of writing. And the three threads that are in the braid are plot, hero, and world. And all three of those are important, and they need to support and strengthen each other if you're going to have a strong story. So this week, we're going to work on world specifically. And I know that's in the back order of the order that I just read them. When I'm writing a story, I actually start with world, and particularly genre, and then I work backward and I create characters next, and plot is the last thing that I make. And so I want to take you through the creation process in that order as well.
Well, I think for me, that is the order that kind of makes the most sense, right? You create your world first, because otherwise your hero might not fit into it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I
Or,
guess now that you say that, world is really broad, and character, I mean, a character spans an entire lifetime, and usually a plot spans, days, maybe weeks, but you're kind of narrowing with each of those as well.
yeah.
Okay, so, and just by way of a little more review, so we talked about J.R.R. Tolkien. Well, actually, so we talked about how with those three items in the braid, you need to be strong at all three to be successful as an author. But some stories still tend to lean on one more than others. And so we talked about how Tolkien, he's kind of the king of creating a really incredible fantasy world. We also talked about In the Heights. It's a Broadway that just got made into a movie. My wife and I saw it, and she came out of the movie saying there was no
Nothing
plot in
happened.
that.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a fair critique if you're expecting a strong plot movie, but I was loving the whole thing because it's a world movie, and it takes you into the world of this New York suburb, and like it lets you experience it, and that's what it's attempting to do. And then the third example from last week was Jurassic Park. And I wanted to bring that up again because when I say world, I'm not talking about the setting, right? My Jurassic Park happens on Isla Sorna. It's like a Hawaiian island, basically. That's the setting. But the world is a world where science can take DNA and recreate dinosaurs. And that concept that's part of that world is an important part of what we're going to be talking about today.
So, we actually, have you read Dune
Yeah.
by chance?
Mm-hmm.
So we were actually talking about this and kind of the difference between Dune and so Dune inspired a lot of works, and one of them was Star Wars. And so Lucas, one of the things he loved about Dune was how things came down to this melee combat between the central characters in the book. And that's something he really wanted to bring into Star Wars. And, we see that with the lightsaber fights between the Jedis and the Sith. But as we were talking about this in the other podcast floor, one of the things we talked about is in Dune, they have these shields, and you cannot use a projectile weapon against these shields. It blocks anything. And if you use a laser weapon on them, they'll actually create a nuclear detonation in both the firing weapon and the shield itself. And so it reduces almost all of Dune into melee combat because
genius.
of this. Yeah. And so you get these awesome swashbuckling battles between characters in Dune because of these shields. Well, so I remember we were watching Star Wars, and I think it was Solo, and he's pulling out a blaster and they're shooting each other, and I was like, you can't kill anyone with a blaster in Star Wars. What are you even doing? It has to come down to the melee. But the thing is, in Star Wars, there's nothing that makes it that it should, right? Like stormtroopers die by blasters all the time, but they always want to kind of bring down the battle to melee between the main characters. And sometimes it feels almost ridiculous in that way. Blasters just feel useless in Star Wars. And yet for some reason, everybody's packing them around. And what had happened is in building his world, Lucas had left out the why of melee combat in Dune, right? He had neglected that part. Whereas Herbert, in very thoroughly building out his world, didn't. He said, I want there to be melee combat, but there has to be a reason why. And so he created this shield. He says, you shoot a gun at it, it'll stop it. You shoot a laser at it, it's mutual sure destruction.
Yeah, dude, it's genius. I think that is such a brilliant plot point. And I mean, they do this in video games where they'll force you to do melee combat as a game mechanic. And they do that because it's fun. And it's same when you're reading or watching. It's fun to have melee combat. And it's cool that he built that in. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was just, that was just a discussion about world that we had about the differences between Star Wars and Dune. And Star Wars is cinematically far bigger than Dune. But, there's not a lot of people who walk around talking about the Star Wars books like they're amazing. But people always talk about Dune. Yeah. Because Herbert nailed the world, right? There isn't, Star Wars gets, a lot of flack for stormtroopers can't hit anything. Blasters are useless. There's a lot of things we kind of mock of Star Wars. As much as it's a great show, there's still a lot of pieces in the world that kind of fall flat because they're not fully developed and fleshed out, and not all those questions. Whereas for one of the reasons so many people love the book Dune is that it doesn't. Every piece of the world has been thought through thoroughly,
Man, so I have my fingers crossed that this new adaptation is going to be somewhat definitive and we'll rave about it. I sure hope so.
But I mean, part of it is the new creators have to build on the holes that Lucas left, right? So it's difficult. You could have a creator aware of the holes in Star Wars, but they can't plug them because the whole genre, or I guess not genre, the whole series and extended world is built with those holes in it already there.
Yep. So that's true.
It's very difficult to manage that, as a creator contributing to a work as opposed to just creating your own.
Cool, man. Yeah, I'm excited for the new Dune movie. But okay, so on the screen I have 3 novels up here. They're the 3 series that I have begun. And the first one, there's a boy holding a sword. And you listeners, you don't have to see the cover to know. Like I say, it's a boy with a sword. It's fantasy, just like that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like that's all you need to know, that's the genre. And so when you flip that cover, you're expecting sword fights and dragons and sorcery, right? It's built into that boy holding a sword. The next image, I don't have to describe any part of it except to say that, and in the background, there are stars. And immediately you're like, oh, it's a sci-fi. And the rest of the image is there's a pilot, he's holding a helmet, there's a planet over his shoulder, and in the background there are stars. But all you need to know from that little clue is, you know, this is sci-fi, space opera, I guess, in particular, but you get it from the cover. And now the third one, if you can't see it, there's an image of, it kind of looks like a human figure who's on fire. It's kind of this weird silhouette. There's an overlay. And then you look at the title and you're like, well, the title says it's called X dot. That's a word I've never heard of. And people look at this book and they have zero clue what the genre is. Yeah. Zero clue.
Yep.
And this is the first thing that I want to talk about in our genre or our world discussion, is picking your genre. And I just kind of wrote 3 steps that you need to make sure you nail in order to get your genre. The first one is you need to know what your genre is. And when I started that book, X dot, it was something that didn't fit in with anything I'd heard of. So if you asked me the genre, I'd probably say, I don't know. It's young adult. That's what I'd say. And that's not very good. So you need to know your genre. 2, you need to be able to communicate that genre. And I had that same struggle with X dot. I'll talk about it in one sec. And then 3, you need to deliver on that genre. And so, I was just going to add. So to you listeners, we have an episode that dives deep into genre. So this is kind of a rehash of that in short. But anyway, Joe, go ahead. You had a comment.
I don't remember if we covered this in the episode or not, but I remember a writer talking about one of the ways he had helped sharpen his writing to really appeal to his readers. Is he says, I found authors that I felt like I wrote similar to, and I read their reviews, the good and the bad. He says, what did people rave about? What did they love that they talked about in these reviews? And what did they hate? And he says, and then I could take those 2 pieces of information and apply them to my own writing.
Man, that's great advice. So I have a homework assignment here in 2 slides, and I want to tack that onto the end because that's perfect. Like, go look up what the reviews are raving and complaining about. That's awesome. And the complaining part is this step number 3. You have to deliver what they want. So you've shown them from your book cover what genre this fits into. But when they turn that cover flap, and what's inside has to match. It has to be what they're expecting. It has to be what they want out of that genre. And you better deliver on that expectation, or it's not going to be good. So when I pitch X dot now, years later, it's been like a decade, I say it's The Sandlot meets Inception. And every single time I get these wild looks, and people, it's like this expression that says, I don't exactly know what you said. I'm going to need a few minutes to think about it, to put those 2 together.
Yes, you have to take a minute to kind of puzzle that through. And I think only because I've read X dot, I can answer that. I'll be like, oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah, so even with my best short pitch, people still don't get it. And I'll get readers who, they love fantasy, so they'll read Song of Locke, or they love sci-fi, so they read Star Child. And then after they've read my other books, they go to X dot. And then I've had people say, this was actually my favorite book out of all the ones you've read. But it's so hard for me to convince people to read it. Like, they do love it. It's a good book, great characters, solid ending, but they won't read it because it's not fitting into a genre that people recognize, and they don't realize it's going to fulfill what they're expecting.
And I mean, a lot of people, we read in genres because certain types of stories really appeal to us for one reason or another, you know. Like a lot of your, like, so if we look at the Marvels, the Avengers, right? Like, when you go into these superhero movies, you have a good idea of the kind of journey and adventure you're going to have. There will be a villain. There will be epic battles and struggles and weaknesses and, you know, all of that. We expect that. But if you look at like the winners of all these Academy Awards and stuff, they give out the awards to movies that they're not telling these grand epic stories. What they're doing is often exploring a piece of human life that has never been shown on film before, a piece of the human experience that has yet to be captured in this art form. That's usually what they're giving out the awards for. And it creates a lot of disconnect because that's what they want to give the awards for. To I guess perhaps their end goal is to include as much of the human experience in film as possible by awarding the award that way. But that often means that a lot of times the winners of these big awards are not films that most people are interested in seeing. They're like, that's, I mean, yeah, I guess that's a part of the human experience, but that's not a story that interests me. That's not my genre.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Dude, that's pretty cool. I've never thought about it that way.
Yeah. And so I think X-Dot is very much that way. It's the capture of a kind of story that's uncommon and unfamiliar. And there is definitely a group of people who, when they consume literature, and I guess the genre that often in when we're talking books is literature, right? That's often what literature is and about, is capturing a new perspective or a piece of the human experience that has not been captured before.
Yeah.
Whereas in genre fiction, we go in expecting a certain kind of story, whether that be a murder mystery, an action thriller, a superhero, epic fantasy. We go in expecting a certain kind of story. Whereas, with a literary work, or, it's designed to give you something you've never seen before.
Yeah.
But a lot of times that means it may not interest you.
Yeah. Well, and so I kind of wanted to share this personal story because it was a big thing that I learned by writing and learning how hard it was to pitch this, to convince someone to read it. Again, I'm telling you, they love it when they do, but it's just such a barrier to get people to read it. And so my advice would be, I think a lot of new writers have these kind of crazy, wild ideas, and they're probably good ideas, but my advice would be to either shift it toward a known genre, or write it as a practice novel, or shelve it until you've built up the credibility that people will read it because your name is on it, rather than because it's the genre they love.
What is it? I actually just picked up. It's a book by George R.R. Martin, and it's set in the Game of Thrones worlds, but it's not a Game of Thrones novel. It's A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. It's about 100 years before the Game of Thrones takes place. And I remember reading it, and I was about 10% into the book and thinking, if this wasn't George R.R. Martin, I would have put this down by now. Because at that point it felt very predictable, but I was like, this is George R.R. Martin. This is going to turn in a way I can't see coming. And that's, what kept me going in the book until it turned enough that the story itself had my interest.
Yeah, that's like, if you're famous, or if you've proven yourself you have this certain amount of grace, you will not have when you're starting out. But okay, so the homework for this week, and I'm showing it like halfway through the lesson, but I want you to brainstorm a list of stories that you love that are in your genre, and I want you to write down at least 10 of these. And then the second step is to write a list of 10 features that these have in common. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a feature that's in all 10, but say 4 of them have this thing, another 3 of them have this thing, 5 of them have that. And figure out what it is that your story ought to have in it if it's going to meet the expectations of that genre. And then again, I would tag on that number 3, which is go read the reviews of those and figure out what was good and what was not.
Well, and a similar technique that I've kind of been watching recently is a lot of times some of these great stories that come out are built on the bones of historical stories that have just persisted and rewritten. Like the Game of Thrones is based on the War of Roses, which was the battle for the English throne. Which was I think it was 100 Years' War, and that's really where he was building the Game of Thrones on, all these different factions in English history, and just wrote it into a fantasy setting. Similarly, the Hunger Games were based on the Servile Wars with the Romans, with the rise of Spartacus and the slaves that revolted. Yeah, but I mean, if you're familiar with that piece of Roman history, it's like, oh yeah, how could it be anything else? Like Katniss is Spartacus. Right, you have this gladiator who goes in the arena. They're awesome and unstoppable, and then they lead the people in revolt against the masters. Like it's the Servile Wars.
Yeah, that's so great. I never made that
beat
connection.
For beat, yeah. Well, and I think Isaac Asimov, his famous Foundation series, and they're coming out with a movie for that. Not a movie, a television series I think in the next couple months here. He wrote that based on the fall of the Roman Empire, and so you have some of these great works of fiction that are not raw fiction. What they did is they say, here's human history, and here's the stories that have really survived that, because our history is just so big and so vast, but there really is a small collection of stories that really survive that wake of history. And then these authors take that and then graft it into their fiction.
Yeah, man. So I am just in awe at George Martin and the world that he created. And I mean, I'm going to use the word cheating. It's like he was cheating to get there by basing it on history. But I mean, this was like clever cheating or honorable cheating. I don't know. Like, he did a really cool thing by building that world on that. And his new world that then exists after is just stellar. I just think he did so many cool things. But
he really did. Yeah,
it reminded me of a little anecdote. So Joe, you pointed out to me that I was writing a space opera, and I had some cool space battles in book 1 and book 3, but there wasn't any flying in book 2. And it had kind of morphed into like Space Marines. Like, this was ground war, which is fine. Right. It's a cool story, but I purposefully just tried to insert a little of that back in because I knew that readers would be expecting it. You were right, and I love that you pointed that out to me.
Huh. I don't even remember that conversation.
Oh, yeah, that was totally you. But anyway, okay, so I took Brandon Sanderson's lecture series, and it's just an interesting side note, but he recorded his lectures 2 times. He teaches every semester, every year. And he filmed it twice, and I happen to have taken his class both the times that he filmed it. So,
really?
On the screen here is a picture of Sanderson up on stage, and then the back of my head. I'm pretty proud of this photo.
That's funny.
But I specifically wanted to talk about something that clicked when he talked about it, that he taught, I guess I should say. He has something called a story Bible. And the story Bible is where you put all your notes about the world that you're building.
Yeah.
And man, he's a huge world guy. Like, that's his expertise. So I created this diagram here, and it shows the 3 Star Child novels that I've written. They're both just over 100,000 words, but my story Bible is longer than any one of those individual titles.
Wow.
And I'm showing you this as an example of the immensity of what this undertaking could be. Now, I'm not saying you have to write a story Bible this long, and there's some particular reasons that mine is that long, but there's a lot that can go into creating a world, and this story Bible is how I do it, and I got the idea from Sanderson, and I kind of want to take you through my process of doing that. Okay. So, going back to the parade, we have plot, hero, and world. Those are the main features. That's like how you organize the world. And then I'm going to take you through a whole bunch of extra ones that I just want to share because they're good to think about. And then we'll dive specifically into what I do for world. So this here is essentially the table of contents for my story Bible for Star Child. So chapter 1 is world building. And I'll dive into that in one sec. Let me go through the rest of these. Number 2 is character sketches. So that's where I'll write down a character's name, and I have a long list of questions that I like flesh out the character. Well, that'll be tomorrow, next month's lesson. Chapter 3 is a plot outline. So that's where I take more detailed notes on what I'm expecting the story to look like or to be shaped like. That changes a lot as I go, but I start by having some sort of a plot outline. Chapter 4 is themes. Chapter 5, so on the right side here, these aren't listed, but I have a revision section. And so as I'm drafting, I'll write down questions that I want to ask my beta readers. And then after I have a beta reader go through my book, I have a phone call with them. These usually take 20 to 40 minutes. And I take notes. It's like a journal entry on their feedback or their experience as they were reading my book. So that's a section that goes in the story Bible. The next chapter is publication. So I'll copy down artwork that I think is good, that could inspire the cover or whatever. And even if you're not an artist, I do a lot of my own art, but if you're not, this is a great thing to do so that you have something to show your artist and say, I kind of want this style, or maybe merge these 5 things or something like that. I'll put all the epigraphs for the entire series. I'll do the pronunciation guide. I make up a ton of words when I write, and so I'll keep track of all those. When I get ideas about marketing, so it's the Sandlot meets Inception. When I get those ideas, I throw them into the story Bible so that they're ready to go. And I just feel like letting some of these ideas stew is really helpful. So the earlier you can insert them, the better.
Right.
Another segment I have is audiobook instructions. And the best example I can give, I've read several books where the text of the book will have like a, what's it called? Binary, 100111100. And the narrator will read the whole thing, and it's like a page worth of numbers. And
Whoa.
what the author's really trying to communicate is there are a lot of numbers here. You don't actually need to know if it's 1001 or 1110. And so I'll take notes that are instructions to say, hey, it looks like this in the book, but here's a good idea how to do it. Or this character should have this accent or whatever. And I'm compiling those as I go so that when I'm ready for that phase, I'm ready. The next chapter of the Story Bible is what I'm calling DVD extras. But if I write something that I think is good, but it doesn't fit in the story, so I delete it, that goes into a deleted scenes section. I also,
I guess on my deleted scenes, so I wrote the first draft of the final book in my series, the 5th book, and then I sat down and had a conversation with Jay, and we walked through the whole plot, and he gave me some notes, and those notes changed everything from chapter 8 on. So I had to throw out all of those chapters. And so there's a massive chunk of deleted scenes for that book, because essentially I hit chapter 8 and the book takes a totally different direction, right? So just kind of surprising how many deleted scenes you can end up with.
Man, what kind of a friend does that to you?
Oh, it's good. It was good because your point was dead on.
And so I think Joe, you gave me this idea maybe. Actually, I'm not sure. But the DVD extras, I haven't really done anything with them for any of my books, but I imagine someday when I have a strong group of super fans, this will be the kind of content that I'll send to them.
Yeah, I mean, they're great for email lists and everything, but until you have a big enough email list for it to impact your growth as an author, like I think for me and for you, like DVD extras are a great idea down the line, but I probably won't do anything because they've got to be polished up before you can release them. And right now, the bigger focus for us is just get out more books because we're trying to hit that threshold where we become full-time authors.
Mm-hmm. Man, and I just have to say, I'm showing you a slide that has this very well organized. The actual document is a wreck. And I mean, it does have headings, but it just looks terrible. And the reason is it's meant to be a tool, and I don't want to spend a lot of time cleaning it up and making it look nice.
Right,
so,
because it's not intended for reading.
Yeah. So these DVD extras are ready to be edited, but they are certainly not ready to be published. Okay, then so real quick, I have a section for sequels, and I have a timeline for the whole series. I have titles for the whole series. And of course, it's all work in progress for that kind of stuff. But titles are big. Like I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before. I'm bothered by the Chris Nolan Batmans. It's Batman Begins, so we have a character name and a verb. And then the second one is The Dark Knight, which I'm honestly fine with those two going together. But then the third one is just the second one's title again, but then adding on the verb like the first one. And it just, to me, it doesn't seem like they're a set of 3 that go together. It's like kind of 3 weird. Anyway, so I keep titles down and I brainstorm other titles and I want them to all line up really well with each other. Now I just want to mention a couple of the world building subsections that I put in the Story Bible. So first of all, the map. And my other books have maps. Star Child actually doesn't have a map, but I still have like a text map essentially. And I list planets, and I list which cities are on each of those planets. And by the way, this is not exhaustive. It's just the ones that are talked about in the book so far.
Right, yeah.
And then I'll sometimes put notes in there about, well, this is where so-and-so was born, or this is where this event happened, or they referred to this here. It just makes it easy. I don't have a stellar memory for this kind of small detail, so this is a huge helpful tool when you're making up this vast world and you got to keep track of it. I have a section for food. Again, there aren't bananas on these foreign planets, so I have to make up the food names. Same with animals. I have a list of conscient species. So these are thinking species that aren't human.
So you're using this word conscient. What's the reason for the choice there? Just personal curiosity.
Man, that's so funny. It's been so long that I made that decision that I don't remember. I think conscient just means like it's a word to mean you're above animal, basically, or like
right.
you're thoughtful, or anyway. So I have a section for the armory, and it's a list of military stuff and there are 3 different main factions in Star Child, and so each of those have different types of military equipment, and it gets complicated. So I keep track of that in the story Bible. I have general tech. I have words that I made up that weren't already in one of the categories I mentioned. I have a segment on time, and this is very specific to Star Child, but a day on Mars and a day on Earth are different. And so there's a standard unit that they use in the Star Child galaxy, and they call it a wake sleep cycle. And so it's like an arbitrary day. And so I keep track of all that. I have a section for history. This is stuff that some authors might put in a prologue. It's the history of what's gone on in this world so far.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, it's not exhaustive. It's the stuff that I've thought of and the stuff that I feel like matters for the story. I have a big subsection on the magic system, and that has multiple subsystems beneath it, or subsections. And then, because I'm trying to write somewhat hard sci-fi, like I'll talk about this in a bit, but Star Wars is pretty soft, very little science, and I'm trying to have some decent science in there. So when I come across a cool article or a cool concept, I'll throw that into the story Bible, and sometimes I'll research and dig deeper, and I put all that research into the story Bible so that those things are all ready to go in the story. So now that I've gone through this table of contents, you have a sense of like, oh, okay, I could see that being as long as a novel. I wanted to go through a couple specific examples. So up here in the top left, so these are all from Song of Locke, but there's something called the Four Futures. And this is like a religious concept. And I honestly have very little religion in Star Child, but it seemed important in Song of Locke. And so that's a detail that belongs in one story, but not in another. These other ones, like there's a diagram of elementals that go with each creature. Then the orange one is there are 5 gods, and all of creation is organized beneath these 5 gods. And that was part of my world building. And then the last one, the green one, there's a melody that's referenced in Song of Locke, and so I wrote a melody and I threw that in there as part of the world building. And here are a couple specifics from Star Child. So interstellar travel is not very feasible with the theory of relativity, but it's fun to be able to do interstellar travel in a space opera. So
right.
There's like a fantasy, there's a magic system that I have for them traveling planet to planet. Now, over on the hard science side, I mess around with the concept of, well, what if a planet spins much faster than Earth does? Or what if it spins much slower? Or what if it doesn't spin at all? And so I do, like, this is part of the world building, figuring that out and then explaining it and presenting. And for me, I do a lot of visuals with that. That's kind of why I'm doing this. But yeah, there's so much. So the next one, it's a drawing of one of the 6-legged creatures that's in the story. And then I have a map of a battle. So these are just ideas of the types of things that you might put in a story. Now, let's say you have a fantasy story and you have a king as one of your characters. It's probably important for you to world build about economics and diplomacy, right? You got to figure that stuff out so that you know, like, you can put that in the story because the king's going to encounter it. If you do that exact same world, but your story is about a little peasant boy, you're probably not going to mess with economics. Well, I guess you could mess with economics still. Probably not diplomacy, right? And so you got to figure out what details need to be fleshed out, and then you dive into those in your story Bible. Okay, oh, did you have a comment?
No.
Oh,
Good.
okay.
It's good.
So,
very thorough. Yeah.
I mentioned Star Wars has like zero science, and I'm trying to make Star Child more sciency. Actually, a better example is The Expanse, right? In The
Yeah,
Expanse, they're
very
flying in
science.
stars just like Star Wars, right? But if you accelerate too fast, you die in The Expanse. And that's never even touched upon in Star Wars. Same with
Yeah,
deceleration, right? Rapid deceleration is what kills you in a car wreck. And that's a subject in The Expanse because it's on the hard side.
yeah,
On the screen here, I have soft represented by Harry Potter and hard represented by Brandon Sanderson. Well, honestly, I have Way of Kings up here, but anything Sanderson.
yeah,
And I just kind of wanted to talk about the trade-off between the two because I want you as a new writer to be aware of where you stand genre-wise, but also where you stand on this spectrum of soft versus hard. So in Harry Potter, well, and again, this is particular with sci-fi and fantasy. It's not going to apply very well to if you're writing a romance or whatever other genre. So if you have a soft magic system, you're probably going to have more wonder, more awe, more mystery. But the trade-off is there's some hand waving. And honestly, I love Harry Potter, but if I were to critique it, I would say I wish that I understood why they didn't use this magic because it works so well over here. Why didn't they use it here?
yeah,
And you're never going to get that answer with a soft magic system.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, go
And
ahead.
was it? I think this is Sanderson's law, right? That the audience ability to understand a magic system is directly correlated with their ability to like enjoy or I guess appreciate magic solving a problem.
hmm Yeah, so you can only solve the problem with magic if the reader really understands the magic in depth. And with Sanderson, like you'll see that my little visual has a periodic table. Sanderson magic is like a periodic table, and you can count the elements, and you know if there's a missing piece, and you know how they fit together. It's all there, and there's nothing outside of it. You know the limitations of his
Yeah.
magic system because he gave you the whole thing, or at least what ought to be there, and you're filling in the last few pieces as you read. That's not the same with Harry Potter. I'm not sure on this, but I think there's only like 20 or so spells in all 7 Harry Potter books. And if she throws in a brand new one in book 7, you're not surprised because she never said, I've told you all there is to know.
Yeah.
And again, that's wondrous and it's fun, but you just can't solve your plot with that kind of magic, or the reader's just going to be like, well, where the crap did that come from?
Yeah. It feels a little Deus Ex Machina, right?
Exactly,
Just,
exactly.
yeah.
And on the other hand, with Sanderson, you can't bring in extra cool stuff because they're going to say, no, you already gave me the periodic table and there's no spot for this thing. Like you can't add to it now. So that there's like pros and cons of being on both ends of this spectrum. This is the magic system from Star Child, and like between hard and soft sci-fi, I'm trying to go more toward the hard side, but it's like in between on those two. Like it's between The Expanse and Star Wars. And the same with the magic system. There are 9 elements in my system, but I really only cover 4 or 5 in the books. So it kind of leaves the back end open and mysterious. And honestly, I wasn't aiming for one end of the spectrum or other. That's just kind of where it happened. And that's actually kind of my advice to new authors. Like, write the kind of story that makes sense for you as an artist, but know what that is and know what the strengths and weaknesses are so that you don't make a Deus Ex Machina type mistake.
Yeah, if you've got a soft magic system, well, then the final conflicts and the big problems can't be solved with magic,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Because it's soft, right? Whereas, like Sanderson, if the big battle is all magic, that's fine because we understand what it can and what it can't do, and there's nothing surprising us there in that final conflict.
Man, and if I hope this is okay to say, I gave a critique of Harry Potter, which is sometimes I wish I knew why the magic wasn't doing what I want it to do. And sometimes I have the opposite critique in Sanderson. He is so detailed in his magic that I often feel like I haven't studied it enough to get the full story. And and essentially, I think it means, yeah, you can dig really deep into Sanderson, and that's a huge pro. That's a huge benefit for many, many readers. It can also be a hindrance for a reader like me who just hasn't nerded out enough to really, I really do feel like I'm missing part of the story because I haven't gotten as deep into it as I probably would have back when I was younger. But okay, so this is I have maps in the beginning of each of my books, and actually XDOT has a hand-drawn map, but this is a screenshot from Google Earth, and it's of the street I grew up on, and XDOT takes place on the street I grew up on. And I think this is significant because I told you it's the Sandlot meets Inception. The Sandlot part, like kids in a neighborhood playing, I didn't have to world build for that because it was my own childhood. And I think that was a huge benefit to not have to world build a ton. Now, having said that, the other half of XDOT is the meets Inception part. And I had to figure out a pretty complicated magic system that deals with how you're transitioning from the real world to the dream world and how those two worlds collide. And it was actually very challenging. And it was a relief to me that I wasn't also building some massive fantasy world to fit that into. It allowed me the time to go deeper into the magic system. And so the reason I'm sharing this and telling this story is because every writer, you who are listening, you have expertise. And whether that's the street you grew up on, or it's because you studied chemistry in, your freshman year of college, or whatever your expertise is, consider drawing on that and putting it in your novel and allowing it to be a part of your world building. And I'm guessing if you're an expert in that field, it's probably because there's something really cool about it. And you probably know more about the coolness than your average reader. So use that to your advantage. Invite them into this cool thing you know about. And that's going to be a cool way to flesh out your world. And it's a shortcut. This is the map from Song of Locke. And again, I'm very much a graphic artist, but what I want to encourage you listeners on this slide is draw, even if it's stick figures on sticky notes, right? Draw it and have something that you can then hand over to an artist on Fiverr and have them turn into visuals. And it honestly doesn't take a ton of money or effort or, this great expensive artist. You can have your world building transferred and aided by other people who are good at this kind of thing. And to me, I love the visuals, and I just think it's a good thing to consider as you're going. It's been a long lecture. We're about to wrap it up. I think this may be the most important thing that I say in this. And it's the abstraction ladder. I used to teach freshman English, and this is something that I would teach. So if you're listening, not watching, at the top of the ladder, we have animals. Animals is an abstract concept, right? And it includes a lot. You can chop that down to livestock. That's the next rung down the ladder. And livestock means an animal that's on the farm. You can chop that down again and say, well, cattle. Like, I'm not talking about chickens and goats, just cattle. So we're narrowing, but cattle is still an abstraction. It's a concept. We can take it down one more notch to a Holstein heifer. That means black and white splotches, female. This is the typical milk cow, and I would trick a lot of my freshman students with this. I would say, is this an abstraction? And yes, it is. A milk cow is still just a generic that could be anything. And to really take it down to the concrete base level, the final rung is Bessie, right? Bessie is a specific cow. She's not a concept of a cow. She's one particular cow. And when we're writing, when we're creating our settings and our magic systems and our worlds and any part of the braid, plot and hero as well, you want to try to get down this abstraction ladder to the very bottom. And you don't want to say abstractly, she was nervous. You want to say her palms were sweating. Her knees were shaking, right? And as I'm saying this, you're like, oh yeah, I've heard that. It's called show, don't tell. This is exactly what I'm trying to get across. when you're creating your world, in your story Bible, it's fine to tell, but in your book, you need to show the world, and you need to get down to the bottom and introduce them to Bessie, not just to the concept of Holstein heifers.
Not just to the concept of Holstein heifers. Good.
Okay, 2 more quick slides and then we're done. Sorry, this is a little longer than I expected.
That's okay.
So,
it's our show.
The Great Gatsby, right? I just think this is a stellar novel. If I asked you, what do you remember from The World? I think the first thing most people would raise their hand and say, the green light, right? And honestly, yeah, he nailed it with that. I'm going to read what hopefully is, what might be your second thing is The Eyes of God. I don't know if you remember, there's this billboard.
I do remember the eyes, yeah.
Let me read this quote. It says, above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, blue and gigantic, retinas 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles, which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently, some wag of an oculist, that's like a optometrist back in the day, some wag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or forgot them and moved away. So this is Fitzgerald's description of this billboard. And you get this sense of abandonment. And then there's this weird thematic symbol of God watching us. And later he said it's like the eyes of God watching. And I'm bringing up this example because he doesn't point out this is how the power lines looked. And this is what the edge of the road was like. And this is the sidewalk. He focuses on this one particular thing that's going to strengthen the braid. Like it's going to give you a sense of this rundown town or the borough of Queens, but it's going to bolster the theme and stuff too. And when you're writing your world into your book, you need to do the same thing. You're going to write a whole novel's worth of story Bible, and you can't put that whole thing in there. And you got to pick the stuff that matters, that stands out, that's going to resonate with your readers. And it's going to be stuff like the green light and the Eyes of God billboard.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess with the billboard, what we talk about is I forgot the word. Something in set piece, landscape and centerpiece. And so the landscape is you give like just a general idea of the area, right? You know, a rundown junkyard. And then the centerpiece is you pick one thing that is iconic. So I remember I went down to this it was a private owned little pizza shop in this tiny little town. And the weird thing is the pizza shop was like split with a gas station. Half of it was gas station, half of it was pizza shop. And the centerpiece I like to tell people about is on the cash register was a yellowed piece of paper with handwritten marker on it. And it read, "For a restroom, ask at gas station next door."
That's so great.
So the landscape is it's this little family run pizza shop in this tiny little town, and then the centerpiece is this sign that you see there to kind of and the sign is supposed to let you then fill in all the other little details of that pizza shop based on the centerpiece I've given you.
No, it's crazy when you give that short little description. I feel this fondness for the place and like a repulsion, like, oh, can I eat this pizza? But you brought me there with that detail. That's awesome. Okay. So the last thing for me, the key to inspiration is knowledge. And some of my coolest ideas came from very disparate sources. So I have an image up here of the Tim Ferriss show. I haven't been as avid a fan lately, but years ago, I listened to every single episode of the Tim Ferriss podcast. And he interviewed people that I never would have looked up or given time to. But they gave me these crazy ideas that ended up going into my stories. And I think making them much richer. And I noticed, because I actually shifted away from listening to podcasts over to books, which I think has its own benefits. But I did notice that loss, that I wasn't getting all these crazy ideas from different sources anymore because I wasn't going out and finding them. I just thought I'd mention Shakespeare's Macbeth. I was watching the Fassbender version, and something that Shakespeare said inspired a line in Star Child 3. A video game I really like called StarCraft inspired some of the military combat, which is not surprising since it's sci-fi. But and then I lived at a place called Alta, and I met some lifelong friends there, and so that inspired the name of Alta Squadron in Star Child 2. And I just kind of want to throw these out as examples of your whole life as an author can contribute to this world building process. And so like be open to that. And I feel like the story Bible facilitates that, because you get these random ideas and you don't know where to put them, but you throw them in the story Bible and they're waiting for you when you come back and you're like, you know what, now I'm ready for that piece. It goes right there. So that's a recommendation I have as you're building your worlds. Okay, that's basically it. Joe, do you have any final comments for this episode?
No, that's it.
Okay, so next week we're going to look at characters. Sorry, I keep saying next week. In 5 or 10 weeks, we'll be looking at character. That will be the next episode. So I'm excited to get to it. In the meantime, refer back to your homework if you're interested in doing that. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. It's time to start writing.